When everybody lived in Israel, what happened when it was a new moon, it would be declared, they go to Sanhedrin and they would light signal fires, and everybody knew that that was the start of the new month, and that's how you knew when the holidays were to begin. What happened is the Samaritans, who were living in the northern part of Israel, started to light false signal fires. So they stopped doing that tradition and instead would send out runners. So they go to the outlying communities. So as far away as a runner can make it, that's how you're able to proclaim the start of the new month. And that's how you knew when the holiday began. And so as Jews started to leave the area of Israel, mostly due to persecution and expulsion and things like that, we got too far away from Jerusalem. So then they added in an extra day in case, God forbid, you got the start of the new month wrong. So you do 2 days of an extra day of Rosh Hashanah, an extra day of the Shalosh Regalim, which are Sukkot, Passover, Shavuot. What's one holiday you don't do an extra day of? Yom Kippur, because we are known for fasting between meals, not for fasting for 2 days. But the truth is a little more complicated, which is, and I'm getting the question, I haven't forgotten just yet. The truth is a little more complicated because I suspect what was really going on, going back to these rabbinic interpreters, is they're reminding you that you don't live in the land of Israel. They knew when the new month took place. The same moon exists for everybody. So that's another one of those where they're saying you do an extra day to remind you that you're not living in the land of Eretz Yisrael. And so on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, the text actually that's traditionally read is Pakad Sarah, where God remembers Sarah, because up until that point, she's been unable to bear children. And then the second day is the Akedah. The Akedah, of course, is the much more dramatic reading. And so like with shofar, when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat, you're not supposed to sound shofar, because you're not supposed to blow the shofar on Shabbat. But being Reformed Jews, regardless, if it's on Shabbat, we're doing the Akedah and we're blowing shofar. So why the Akedah? Well, when Abraham is about to offer up Isaac as a sacrifice, what is put in his stead? The ram. And how was the ram found? It was caught in the thicket by its keren, by its horn. So there's always, we're not necessarily the most imaginative people all time. So the keren, it reminds us of the potential sacrifice of Isaac, but also about the redemption of Isaac and the sacrifice that the ram made in his stead. So those are two of the reasons for the connections, but of course, rabbis being the people we are, we like to come up with lots of different sermons to sort of explain it. But getting down to the Peshat, the simple, straightforward reason, that's why. It's because it was caught in the thicket by its keren, by its horn. And as a reminder, the horn was the ancient system of creating loud sound to get everyone's attention. There weren't microphones back then, so you were limited options, and the shofar was the main form of getting people together for ritual purposes, but also for warfare as well. So we have a long history of using the shofar in our community. Yes?
So I have a question.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry if I get emotional. I don't know why. I'm feeling emotional about this question. So as many know, I'm converting. And as many of us know, Christianity is the dominant religion in America. I've gotten a lot of opinions, most of them very hurtful, from positive to going to hell and that sorts. How do you remember and stand firm in your beliefs when some of the closest people around you are committing microaggressions without even realizing it?
So I can speak to this, I think, in part because, as I mentioned at the start of the service, I grew up like a lot of you here in the greater Nebraska, greater Omaha area, I grew up in Spring, Texas. My father is a rabbi, he's now retired. He had a pulpit that covered an area roughly half the size of Rhode Island. So it was a big area. We were spread out, not a lot of Jews. I went to a high school of 3,000 kids. There were 2 Jews, and we didn't get along. And Houston, like many other areas, is kind of like the buckle of the Bible Belt. So I certainly experienced a lot of microaggressions. One of the stories I tell, and I'll probably tell in a sermon more than once, is I was in marching band. Now, football may be the religion of Texas, but marching band is a close second. Imagine show choir in Texas. And so every Friday night we were there at the game, and I say this with and without ego. We were the best marching band in the state of Texas and one of the best in the country. My first 2 years, we won all state. And then the third year, we went to Grand Nationals and came in second by 0.05 of a point, and we're still bitter about that. So I mention this because before every football game, what do you do? What happens before every football game in a public school setting? You start with a prayer. Every time. In a public school. In an activity I'm required to be at if I want to participate in marching band. And in whose name is this prayer offered up 99% of the time? So I wouldn't stand. I'm like, you know what, this prayer is not directed at me, it's not inclusive, it's exclusive. It's pointing me out that I don't belong, that I am not being taken into consideration for this. And inevitably, I would get into very verbal arguments with the saxophone section. One of whom has actually subsequently apologized to me. He said, now I kind of understand what you went through. Then we fought about many other things, but that's a whole other story. Thank God for social media. So what's interesting, it's taken me a long time to learn, is a lot of them, and I'm speaking with a broad brush, but a lot of them are genuinely concerned with our souls. They believe because we haven't accepted Jesus as our personal Lord and Savior, we are doomed to a life of hellfire and damnation, and it's their mission to save us. And that no is not an acceptable answer. Of course, there's a second problem, which is if you read about, and I know it was in the news recently about the rapture and the trial and the tribulation, which is a whole other fascinating story, and we can talk about it another time, but there's this belief that you need to get enough Jews to convert and enough Jews to move to Israel in order for Jesus to come back. So there are competing motives there. So they're worried about our soul, they're worried about our humanity, and they're also worried about their religious future, and we get tied up into it. And people don't know what to do with that. And they don't know how to express it in a loving way, so it ends up always being hurtful, especially because it's denying you the choices you're making. And so you can do a couple of things. One, you can do the passive-aggressive thing I've done, which I've stopped doing, which is, you're going to hell. Well, are you going to hell? Well, no, I'm going to heaven. Great, then I'm happy to go to hell. Because if there are people like you there, I don't want to be there. Or you can say, thank you for your concern about my soul, but the truth is, I think I'm okay. I'm all right with God. I'm proud of my religious heritage that I'm taking onto my shoulders, and I'd appreciate not having this conversation any further. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to talk to my rabbi. And I mean that in all sincerity. I'm happy to talk with anyone about it. But it takes a long time to develop a thick Jewish skin. And there's no real other way around it, and to learn that sometimes the battles are worth fighting, and sometimes you just have to walk away and say, I don't need to get into this conversation with you. And that's okay too. But there's no perfect solution. And then you're also welcome to come talk to me too. And we can commiserate together. Yeah. I'll give you the mic so everybody can hear you.
So I'm a convert as well. I converted November 15th of 2019, and it is very difficult. My family, an example is I had surgery, and my immediate family took it upon themselves to stock my house with pork and to attempt to serve me pork when I was recovering from a major surgery. And it was awful. And I finally, my father would say horribly anti-Semitic things to me, and my mother would just excuse it, as he's old. And I'm like, well, he learned how to use a smartphone, that he can learn, he can change. I eventually sat down with my parents and I asked them, why do you hate the fact that I am Jewish? What is it that makes you hate me and my soul so much? And my mother and my father's response was they didn't believe that I was truly Jewish. And they didn't believe that conversion was possible. But primarily, they did not believe that they could produce a Jewish child because they were both Christian. So it wasn't about me at all. It was the fact that they did not understand this concept of what a Jewish soul is, and that I don't need the same path that they do. So hopefully, and I will say I did stop contact with my parents for a little while and explain to them that they were going to have to at least be civil to me and not stock my house with pork.
Yeah. Well, and that's a very good point. Oftentimes, the people who are the most well-meaning, it's not about you, it's about them. And that's an important lesson to remember. And sometimes, if you can, to create a little distance. And that's okay too. It's all about preserving ourselves and self-care.
First of all, the service today was just beautiful. Everything. Thank you very much. We note Yom Kippur as the holiest day of the year. What about Shabbat?
So, Yom Kippur, the truth is, every day should be a holy day. Shabbat is God's gift to us. Going back to the calendar again. By the way, I will never tell you to take anything on a matter of faith, except one thing. Not God, the Hebrew calendar. The Hebrew calendar is one of the most complicated calendars out there, because usually you either have a lunar calendar like they have in the Islamic world, or you have the solar calendar like they have in the Christian world. But in the Jewish world, we have a lunar calendar, but we have a fall harvest, a spring harvest, and a summer harvest. So we're always constantly readjusting to make sure it doesn't get too out of whack, which is why things get earlier and earlier and earlier, and then they get later. So like this time next year is going to be October, by the way. Mark your calendars. So because of that, there are certain days that holidays cannot fall. For example, Yom Kippur cannot start on a Thursday evening. It cannot, because then you would not have time to prepare for Shabbat. So Yom Kippur is known as Shabbat Shabbaton, the great Shabbat. It is a day of contemplation, a day of soul searching, but nonetheless, it's still modeled in many ways after Shabbat. Shabbat is the one holiday that's dictated by God. It comes every seventh day, no matter what. Everything else, we have a hand, the larger we, have a hand in determining. And so, in case you're wondering why the holidays are, and by the way, we have 7 leap months every 19 years. Gives you a sense of how wacky our calendar is. So, in a sense, Shabbat is the epitome, as rabbis talk about, of the world to come. It's supposed to be the embodiment of what life is supposed to be, a world at peace, focused on study and family and good eating. And the only difference between Yom Kippur and Shabbat is that eating piece. Otherwise, they're very similar in a lot of ways. The only other difference, so during a regular day, we're supposed to pray 3 times a day, again, traditionally speaking, morning, afternoon, evening. Shabbat, we pray 4 times a day. We have an additional service in the afternoon. And then Yom Kippur is the only time where we have 5 services, because we have Ne'ilah, the concluding service, at the end of the day. Just a little bit of additional information. Other questions? Okay, by all means.
At what point historically did the 7 months every 19 years come up? And in diaspora, if that was a long time ago, who kept track of that?
So the calendar, the system of calendration, going back to an earlier question, is not found in the Torah. There are not 12 months listed in the Torah, and if you read through them, they don't even necessarily have the same names as the month that we have in our Hebrew calendar. What happened is, originally, you did Passover in the spring-ish. It wasn't set in stone. You did Shavuot in the summer-ish and Sukkot in the fall-ish. And then when it felt a little bit late, then you move things around a little bit. But around the year 1000, give or take, They're a group of rabbis called the Masoretes, and these are important people for a few reasons. One is they're the ones who created the system of chapter and verse in the Torah. Secondly, they're the ones who added the cantillation trope, so that way we know how to chant Torah, and they also added the vowels, so we know how to read Torah. Because if you've ever seen a Torah, there's no chapter, no verse, no vowels. That's why you got to study out of a tikkun, which has chapters and verses and vowels. But the other piece they did is they created the system of calendration that we have today, and that applies universally. So it applies for all Jewish communities throughout the world. Now the question is, say, hypothetically speaking, you are a Jew, and I think they made a movie about this called Jews. Say you're a Jew who goes to space. Now, aside from Mel Brooks, we have actually had Jews in space, so the question has arisen, among other things, how do you keep Shabbat? How do you even know when Shabbat is when a new day starts, what is it, like every 19 minutes or something like that? And so the determination was, especially when we sent the Israeli astronaut of blessed memory up into space, was that you follow the calendar of your home base. So I believe that for the space station, for the purposes of keeping Jewish calendar, it's Central Time because of Houston. But others do.
Okay, sorry, hi. Why did the prophets stop? Why have we not had anyone?
Well, considering that profits are income over expenses, I don't think they've stopped. Although in this economy, you never know. Sorry, bad rabbi. So what happens is in the Torah, for the most part, God spoke to people directly. God spoke to Abraham up until the Akedah, and then God stopped speaking directly to Abraham and starts speaking to him in dreams and visions, sort of demonstrating the break in their relationship. God spoke to Noah. God spoke to Moses. It says God spoke to Moses panim el panim, face to face. But then at some point, God started speaking to people in dreams and visions, mostly the prophets. Now, there are many more prophets than we find in the Hebrew Bible, because as the rabbis say, most of them were just speaking for their own time. But there were a group of prophets, and it's found in the second book of the Hebrew Bible called the Nevi'im. By the way, the Hebrew Bible's, I call it the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. I do not call it the Old Testament, because that implies it's been replaced by a New Testament, which is a theological statement. And so, according to the rabbis, does anybody know who the last prophet is in the Hebrew Bible? Nope, not Joel. Malachi. Malachi is the last one that God spoke to. Then what happened is the Bat Kol, the voice of God, stopped speaking to us directly, and instead, and this was created by the rabbis because a lot, again, going back to rabbinic interpretation, also helps justify their position. The Bat Kol stopped speaking us directly and started to appear in the Sanhedrin and in this houses of study, in the yeshivot, started to appear in our texts. So if we want to hear the voice of God, it's not that God's going to speak to us directly, which can actually be a very dangerous thing, but instead will only speak to us in chavruta, in partnership, when we engage in sacred study together. So if you want to hear and understand the voice of God, all you got to do is find a partner and study some of our sacred text. And you can get a sense of what it is. Because as I like to talk about, we study Torah in order to understand how to bring a greater sense of holiness into the world. And so when we study our texts in partnership with one another, that's where wonderful ideas can emerge. The one thing you are not supposed to do, which is very popular in other religious traditions, is study the text in isolation. Because studying it in isolation can lead to very dangerous interpretations, especially if you lack sort of the intellectual, not even the intellectual, the academic background in the text. And especially if you're studying, like so many of us, in translation. Because always remember, translation is interpretation. Now, not necessarily most of the nouns. Most of the nouns we know what they are, but to make sense of a text and put it in another language for people to understand requires an interpretive skill. This is why there's so many different examples of the Torah. Now, I don't necessarily find it intellectually interesting to study or compare translations, but every now and then it can be very significant. Say you have the word Alma. Alma means young woman. Now, do young women give birth to children? Sure, happens a lot. That's why we're all here. Say you change the word Alma from young woman to, I don't know, virgin. Do virgins give birth to children? Well, according to religious history, only once. So if you translate the term in a slightly different way, it can have profound theological implications. That's why you always got to be a little careful with any translated text and always read the notes when in doubt. Or as a meme said, and yes, I'm saying this in the sanctuary, if I can remember how it goes. So, everybody know the difference between a butt dial and a booty call? Imagine that, those two words appearing 1,000 years from now. It's a meme out there. Yeah, I just said it. Al cheitcha chatanu lefanecha.
So in my French literature class, we read just certain sections of the Bible to contextualize what the French writers are talking about. And someone in my class had a really good question of the purpose of rest when God rests on the last day, and kind of what was the reason that God needed to rest, and kind of what that means for us, for what rest looks like.
So, great question about rest on Shabbat. So, as I like to tell people, what is the pinnacle of the story of creation? What's the great act of creation? Resting, very good. It's not the world. The world, by the way, was not created in 6 days. Our ancient ancestors didn't believe it was created in 6 days either. Rabbis didn't believe that. And by the way, as an aside related to that, how do we tell time? What's the basis for time? The sun. When was the sun created according to the story of creation? Not the 3rd day, but you're close. 4th day. So up until the 4th day, how did we tell time? Time could have been, a day could have been 24 hours, could have been 36 hours, could have been 1 billion years. We don't know what a day is to God. So creation, when you look at it and compare it to the scientific framework, they weren't worried about that. They weren't trying to understand the origins of life, the universe, and everything. That was Douglas Adams' job. Instead, what they were, for the handful of fans like me, and so what they were concerned about was understanding the human condition. And there are actually 2 stories of creation, by the way. One about the creation of humanity and the other about the creation of Adam and Eve. And they're not exactly the same. Instead, what the Torah is telling us is that the last great act of creation was Shabbat, the day of rest. And this has been one of the great gifts the Jews have brought to the world, because when we're an enslaved people, what's one thing an enslaved people don't get? A day off. And so ever since then, we are commanded to observe Shabbat. Now, admittedly, sometimes we make Shabbat so complicated that it feels like more work than it should be, but that's a whole other story. But the prohibitions on what you're not supposed to do on Shabbat, the 37 categories of Shabbat, come with everything involved with building the tabernacle, the portable structure they used to worship God in the wilderness. So that's where the categories of work come from. So the idea behind rest is you're supposed to take a day where you are freed from the demands of everyday life and to explore holiness, explore sacredness, and also to engage in sort of self-repair of the soul. And that's essential for the human experience. If we work all the time, not only do we risk burnout, but then, like what Rabbi Berzin was talking about, we're going to miss out on life. And so Shabbat is also a reminder to go out and enjoy life as well. So those are just a few of the reasons why, to borrow an Aramaic term, if God could rest on Shabbat, alachat kama v'kama, how much the more so we should do the same as well. Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Rabbi. I know there are a lot of traditions about what you should or shouldn't wear on Yom Kippur. Is there significance to red socks?
There's not a significance to
No.
red socks.
Okay.
But there is a significance to my tennis shoes.
Yes, that I know. That I figured.
So Yom Kippur is not supposed to be a day where you demonstrate ostentatious wealth, or the idea behind it is you're not supposed to wear leather. Now, admittedly, I do have a leather belt on because if I didn't have it on, my pants would be at my ankles. Then I'd be brought up on ethics charges, and that's a whole other story. But you're not supposed to wear leather, and that's the actual reason why I wear the tennis shoes on Yom Kippur. In case you're wondering, no, I do own some nice shoes. This is not just a fashion statement, it's an actual Yom Kippur statement. So it's the one thing. Plus, when you're up on your feet as much as we are throughout the high holy days, it's actually nice. It's like a little gift God has given us as well, that I can get away with wearing them one day out of the year on the pulpit. But the red socks are just because I like to add a little color. Oh, yes, it's absolutely a Nebraska thing. Of course, that's exactly what I was thinking. Subliminally, go Nebraska. Yeah, that's exactly it. K-State for my purple tie, yes. That's it. From now on, I'm just wearing burnt orange. Forget it. We're done. Other questions?
Thank you, Rabbi. You may have answered this before I got here. I came in a few minutes late, but in your rabbinate, what's your favorite thing to do? And outside your rabbinate, what's your favorite thing to do?
So in the rabbinate, I love doing a multitude of things. I love, believe it or not, I do love working with conversion students. I love people who are interested and curious about our heritage and our tradition. But I would say one of my favorite things, aside from going to camp, is what we're doing here, which is teaching, which is a core part of what it means to be a rabbi. Yes, we officiate at life cycle events. We do services. We do high holy days. But to have a chance to teach about our tradition across all ages is really just a wonderful treat to be able to do. In terms of outside of the rabbinate, well, I love playing guitar. As I mentioned last night, I enjoy going to the movies, or at least I used to enjoy going to the movies. Anything having to do with kind of pop culture is always a little bit of fun. Hanging out with friends, which I don't get to do very much because most of my friends are rabbis, and for some reason they're busy the same times I'm busy. I don't know. So those are, and of course, spending time with my family. So those are some of the things I like to do. But adult education especially, and we will get more adult education programs involved in the congregation. Don't worry, it's on my list. I have an ever-growing to-do list of long-term projects, and that is one of them. It has not fallen off the list. It will happen, just haven't had a chance to get to it yet. But there will be more adult learning opportunities outside of, with Rabbi Azriel and, of course, Torah study. So those are coming. Stay tuned, just be a little patient. We have an online question?
I have two questions.
You have two questions?
In the chat.
Okay.
A question from Dory is, do you have your towel?
Do I have my towel? Absolutely. I always have my towel.
Why a towel, Mimi wants to know.
Oh, it's a Douglas Adams reference. I have my towel and I have my Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
And I have a question from Noah. He wanted to ask you, how long does it take for you to write a sermon?
How long does it take to write a sermon? So, people ask me on occasion, what's your sermon writing process? And I say it usually involves caffeine and desperation. The truth is, it depends upon the sermon and what I'm thinking about. Oftentimes for the early days, I start thinking about sermons usually in the late spring, early summer. And there was a time many years ago, I was telling Rabbi Berzin this story. So when I had a student pulpit in Quincy, Illinois, I had all 4 of my sermons written by the beginning of August. I was so proud of myself, and they were all pretty good sermons. I was ready to go. I've never done that before, where I had all 4 ready by the beginning of August. You know what year that was? 2001. 2001. I have never had a sermon ahead of time since then, in part because I think, and I don't want to use the word trauma because it wasn't my trauma, although it was certainly our nation's trauma. you never know what's going to come up. And so even though I have these ideas matriculating or circulating in my mind, percolating, that's the word I'm looking for, percolating in my mind, it's a matter of just finding the time to sit down and put I don't want to say pen to paper because now it's mostly on computer, but some of them, they flow really easily. It might take very little time. Others take hours and hours and hours. The one on Rosh Hashanah fought me a long time, and I ended up writing about 7 pages, and then I got rid of 4 of it to figure out that that was the sermon I wanted to give. And then, of course, then I had to flesh that out and edit it and all that sort of good stuff. So you never know, but, and this did not happen this High Holy Days, but Cantor Alexander was warned by my former cantor, Cantor Neff, that on occasion I will get up, even during the High Holy Days, and say, here's the sermon I've written, but here's the sermon I want to give. I've done that a couple of times as well, because it just ended up not being the sermon that was really in my heart. I don't do that often, but it might happen, because she likes to always have a sermon anthem tied in, so she's been warned. But she said for my first High Holy Days, I better not do that.
When did Judaism become matrilineal?
That is a great question. When did Judaism become matrilineal? So to answer that, let's look at the origins of Judaism, even before it was really Judaism, which was you were Jewish originally if what? Your father was Jewish. Isaac was Jewish because, now they didn't apply the terms, but Isaac was Jewish because Abraham was Jewish. And Jacob was Jewish because Isaac and Issachar and Joseph and Benjamin and Dan and Judah were all Jewish because Jacob was Jewish. So originally, it was always patrilineal. So why did it change? Well, what happened is if you look at a map where Israel is in the Middle East, it is not necessarily a place anyone wants to be, but it is always on the way to somewhere else that people want to be. And so there is this history of conquering armies, either from the north or the south. They would, among other things, conquer the land. And what do soldiers do when they conquer? They steal, they burn, they pillage, and they rape. And so what happens when you become a conquered people is paternity starts to come into doubt until Maury Povich, but that's a much more recent development. And so if you don't know who the father is, and your tradition is based off who the father is, you have 2 choices. Either to say, we don't know if this kid's Jewish, so they're not Jewish, or you always know who the mother is, up until recently. So you just switch it as a matter of dealing with a practical problem. So it became a matrilineal tradition. But a lot of what we do as Reformed Jews, people say we're breaking with tradition. And actually, we're going to an older part of tradition, which is we say you are Jewish if you have a Jewish parent and you're raised as a Jew. In traditional Judaism, you are Jewish if your mother's Jewish, regardless of how you are raised. So that's sort of where the break happened. I can't tell you exactly when in history that happened. I don't know if it was 586 with the conquering the Babylonians, 722 with the Assyrians, or more recently with the Romans. But somewhere along the way, leaders decided to make that change to deal with the practical problem of not being 100% sure about who the father was.
So you had mentioned that Shabbat cannot land, or Yom Kippur cannot land on a Thursday. Is there an instance where it lands on Shabbat? Would it be treated the same as Tisha B'Av, where it just kind of gets pushed to the next day?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope,
So,
we have Yom Kippur on Shabbat.
okay, so then do we fast?
Yes.
On Shabbat?
You do
and Yom
fast,
Kippur?
but
Okay.
you don't have the problem of preparing for Shabbat because there's nothing to prepare. But it's more the issue that if you're fasting on Yom Kippur and it's the day before Shabbat, you can't prepare for Shabbat because you're not supposed to cook on Shabbat. So that's where sort of that problem comes. So yes, Yom Kippur does routinely fall on Shabbat. Sure.
I remember a time talking to Rabbi Abraham.
Yeah?
He said that he does not feel closest to God in synagogue. He finds that connection to God elsewhere. And I was wondering where you find God and where you feel closest.
That's a great question. And first of all, I'd just like to state that on anything I say that you've heard Rabbi Abraham disagree on, I'm right. So the issue, what we have done, the purpose of a sanctuary, because originally it wasn't a Beit Tefillah, it was a Beit Midrash, it was a house of study. The idea behind creating specific houses of prayer was less important than creating houses where we teach and learn and study our tradition. And if you go to some traditional synagogues, the schools are really big and the sanctuaries are really small. Because what happens in a traditional prayer, everybody's praying together but at their own pace. And so in Reformed tradition, where we were inspired by a lot of the beautiful cathedrals we saw, we came up with this concept of creating spaces of worship. And there are sort of two competing notions. One is the sense of awe, and you might go, say, if you visit Temple Emmanuel in New York. It is an incredible space, but you feel so tiny in that space. Or you have a space like here at Temple Israel, which feels, even though it's a big space, it feels much more intimate. And so you feel connection to community and to God. And so what I would say, I don't like to talk a lot about my personal theology, not because I'm not interested in my own personal theology, but I never want anyone to feel that they have to believe what I believe or do what I do in order to feel their souls elevated. So, but what I can tell you is I feel a sense of closeness when I'm with fellow Jews having a meaningful religious experience. So it can be in a sanctuary. I mean, we had some very powerful moments here this morning. Absolutely. And there are certain melodies Cantor did that just lifted up my soul, and the choir. And then there can be moments in study. And there can be moments where we just have meaningful interactions. All of those, like Buber talks about, seeing the holy in fellow human beings. So I do like having designated spaces, but I recognize those don't always work for people and don't necessarily always work all the time for people. So it's a challenge and an opportunity. So I keep checking my watch because we're going to end a little early so that way we can give the musicians a little time to come in and do some warm-up and be ready for the healing service at 3 o'clock. In case you're wondering, I'm not bored. I just want to make sure I don't go over time so that way they have time to prepare and get their instruments ready. And I just mentioned that as my own personal bias because my wife is playing in the band.
Thank you.
I think it's on. Yeah, just speak.
Hello.
There you go.
Hey there. So first of all, thank you for the start off this morning. For those of us that don't like Nebraska because of some of the narrow-mindedness. But I see the narrow-mindedness all over the world. They forget that we're Jewish. And I tell people all the time that I'm Jewish, and you can't do this on Yom Kippur. I grew up when Sandy Koufax didn't pitch in the World Series.
Mm-hmm.
And he called out the major leagues on it. He called out baseball on it.
Yeah.
And I continue to preach to people, even though I'm barely religious. I continue to preach to people that it's Yom Kippur. You can't have that event on that day. And they ignore me. And I'm the first to say that I'll start the fast with a bacon sandwich. I mean, it's not a personal thing. It's a principle thing. And so thank you very much for sharing that.
Sure.
For the young lady that's having issues with her family or friends, I had that in my family. And I am Jewish, and I've been Jewish all my life, but my wife's not Jewish. And been some serious problems about that over the years. Okay, now one more quick question.
Yep.
I know, mama's baby, daddy's maybe kind of thing. My daughter was raised Jewish, born from a non-Jewish mother. Are her children Jewish?
So that depends. Do they practice Judaism in the home?
They don't.
They don't. So then, except on Passover. So what I would say, traditionally, if your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish. That's traditionally speaking. Reform practice, if you have at least one Jewish parent and you're raised as a Jew, and in essence, you live as a Jew. We live in a free and open society today. So if she wanted to connect with her heritage or your grandchildren wanted to, we could find ways to do that very simply. but really it's going to be a choice on their end. They are not automatically included in the people, but they're also not automatically excluded from the people except in certain communities. But I actually wanted to address something you brought up a little earlier, which is something you're going to hear me talk about a lot, which is I'm not very religious. Now, I want us to take ownership of that term because we tend to give that term over to people who tend to have black hats, long beards, dresses in a certain style, and are media darlings for how to portray the authentic Jew. The reality is you're all here. You are all religious. You may do Judaism in a different way than others, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't own your religiosity. Don't give that away to anyone else. What I will often talk about is how to make meaning within the framework of our tradition in your lives. We talked about Shabbat. Does that mean you have to come to services? We'd love to have you, don't get me wrong. But for a lot of us who are very busy people, Friday night might be the only time that we're able to sit down with our family and have a dinner. Imagine making that dinner a little extra special, doing something you don't normally do, maybe even lighting the candles. But that way you're saying, this way we're designating this day as holy and sacred, and this is going to be our family tradition. In my family growing up, my father was a rabbi. So we did the blessings at home, and then they went off to synagogue and left us with a babysitter. But I remember those dinners and those blessings particularly well. So own your Jewishness. Don't let anyone take that away from you. And don't excuse it. If what you're doing you are proud of, own it. Celebrate it. That's what it means to be a proud Reformed Jew. Not to say I'm not religious. Don't talk to me about what you're not. Tell me what you are. Tell yourself and your families what you are. And be proud in that, because that's what it means to be a religious person. Asking these questions is religious. Being here on Yom Kippur is religious. Doing things that make meaning and holiness, that is all religious. And so if there's one thing I hope you take away today, is be proud of being who you are as a Reformed Jew in this wonderful community. Yeah, we have our challenges, but we also have our blessings. And what a great way to celebrate this very powerful and challenging day than to be able to do it together and make meaning together. Thank you, everyone. As a reminder, our healing service starts at 3 o'clock? 3 o'clock. Then our Yesker's at 4 o'clock, and then theEla's at 5:15. So for those of you going about your day, have a great day. For those of you sticking around for healing, hope it's meaningful, and otherwise we will see all of you very soon or later than soon. Shana Tova, everyone.